Good afternoon, Abergavenny. Look, there's a bloke with a loaf on a stick. What's he doing? Well, as Nick just said, I'm going to talk about food riots, and this loaf on a stick fits rather nicely with what I'm about to talk about. But what I want to do first is I want to get you to think about the word riot. I want you to change your opinion of the word riot, you see. Nowadays, a riot is kind of all about youth's obscured identity with hoodies, stealing televisions and things like that. But riot in the context that I'm talking about is very different. I want you to think of a riot of colour, or a riot of emotion, or, to borrow a line from a favourite songwriter of mine, a guy called Nick Harper, cudgelling the air with a riot of a sound. Because I'm going to talk about food riots. And this comes into play. In years gone by, as you're about to find out, people were deeply passionate about food and its availability. And the food riots that I'm going to talk about took place largely in the 18th and 19th century, but they're still going on today. And one of the rallying calls for a food riot was a loaf on a stick. So that, ladies and gentlemen, explains why I'm walking around with a baguette on a twig. Okay, who knew this, right? 2014, as we speak, or as I speak, there's an all-party parliamentary group looking at food poverty and hunger in Britain in 2014. That took me by surprise. They haven't published a report yet, but the early reports indicate that there are somewhere in the region of 1 million people dependent on food banks in this country in 2014. And I thought, is that new? Is that new? Well, no, it's not new, because people have been passionate about making food affordable for centuries. And with 1 million people dependent on the Trussell Trust food banks and all the other independent food banks that are around, there has come a whole wave of making affordable food provision. There are organisations like Food Cycle, there are organisations like the Pig Idea that will take food from supermarkets and recycle it. And these are active people active in the community that are passionate about what they want to do. It is, in my opinion, a minor food riot. But the difference is, the people, like the riots I'm about to tell you about, the difference is that the people taking part in these riots are not afraid of revealing their identity to the authorities. They are directly challenging the authorities. So where do we start? Let's go back to the late 18th century and talk about the Gloucester bread riots in 1776. Now, times were hard back then. They were a little bit different than they were now, because you had the rich landed gentry making up enclosures so people could no longer afford to graze a cow on common land. They weren't even allowed to gather the wood to cook the food back at home. The weather was a terrible thing in 1776. There were floods across all of the southwest of England, a bit like the ones that we had not that many months ago around Oxfordshire and Gloucestershire. And this, of course, pushed the price of food up. Now, what people used to do back then was they would get actively involved. So a typical food riot would take place by a group of people from the community seizing a cartload of corn from the farmer on his way to market. They would take the corn and they would sell it at the market at affordable prices, so people could afford to buy corn to make their bread. And they would gather the money and they would give it back to the farmer along with his cart, and they would say, "That's what your corn's worth. Thank you very much." So the Gloucester bread riots took place around Gloucester, around Tewkesbury, all around this area, and it was very common practice for people to come along and interfere in the market, particularly when times were difficult. A little bit later, you had the bread and beer riots in East Anglia. Again, at the time, the end of the Napoleonic Wars, there were lots of soldiers coming back into their communities and not finding any work, any employment, And again, because of the Corn Laws and the need to victualise armies abroad, the price of food was unbelievably high. And again, around Ely and Littleport and areas of Cambridgeshire and across across East Anglia, people would enjoy the same practice. They would gather under the banner of a loaf on a stick, and they would make claims about the food, taking it to the market and selling it at affordable prices. Well, this kind of practice kind of went on for many years. So just a couple of decades later, there were the swing riots, which erupted across practically every county in the south of England. Again, the price of food was really high, and at the time, the Industrial Revolution beginning to get going, was the introduction of threshing machines. Now, a lot of people will have heard of the Luddites. The swing riots, if you like, were a kind of agricultural cousins of the Luddites. We had farm labourers that would gather and they would smash up corn threshing machines. And this riot, which started in Kent, very quickly spread all the way across the south of England. And the authorities at the time were highly alarmed, and you had the French Revolution going on across the Channel. The authorities were afeared of all-out revolution. And what you found was that the farmers, thinking ahead, would all begin to break up their own threshing machines. In fact, they would invite people to come along and break up the threshing machines to show that they were not going against the will of the people. Now, all of those that were caught and tried at the assizes afterwards were dealt with very severely. There were some 2,000 people that were dealt with in special assizes across the south of England, and a significant number of those were transported far away to Van Diemen's Land, which is now Tasmania. But interestingly enough, in 1834, all those people that were convicted of the swing riots were given a special pardon, and though very many of them came back to England, their names were cleared. So people have been actively involved in food riots for centuries. And coming forward through, after the swing riots, I found a great riot in Cornwall, in New Lynn in Cornwall in 1898, the New Lynn fish riots, which were all about the local pilchard and mackerel and herring fishermen around Cornwall were suddenly opened up to competition from East Coast fishermen who were now using steam trawlers to get down the channel and shipping their catch back to Billingsgate Fish Market via the steam trains which had come into Penzance. People have always fought for food and their ability to buy food and distribute food. And that fight is still going on, in spirit at least, with organisations like Food Cycle and the Gleaning Network, which go into farmers' fields once crops have been gathered, all of the turnips and potatoes or whatever that's left behind. Gleaning networks come in and they recycle the food and push it on to those that can't afford it. So what I want to say to you really is that food rioting is a historical thing. It's still going on. People are passionate about making sure that we can all put food in our bellies. And I'd like you to look out for the work that Food Cycle and other organisations do. And bear in mind that there's an all-party parliamentary group looking at food poverty and hunger in Britain. And I think we really ought to try and do something about that. Thank you very much.